Hello, welcome to another episode of Dress Histories, and today I'm talking about something that is very relevant currently. Particularly we're in the month of September, and some of you may be aware that in the UK Oxfam have launched an initiative called Secondhand September. I'm bringing this to you in the middle of September, so I'm a bit late to the party, but nonetheless it remains a really important conversation to be had. And so I'm going to look today at some of the ways that cloth has been reused, refashioned, valued in the past for a variety of different reasons, and how we can think about it now. It's interesting that I've been doing sort of secondhand September for a really long time. I don't buy new clothes as much as I can help it. I did used to. I had a real kind of fast fashion habit a good few years ago now. I was a sucker for a bargain. When my income was restricted, I bought clothes that were affordable, and I like shopping. And I was actually educated by my students to think about things different. It's one of those great examples where students and the things that they're looking at can teach you something as well. I had begun to supervise a number of dissertations where students were exploring the ills of fast fashion, and some of the statistics that they were bringing back in their research really terrified me and gave me pause for thought about my own habits. And I decided then and there that for 1 year I wouldn't buy anything new other than the barest essentials. And so I did that and found it remarkably easy. I'm lucky that there's a nice secondhand shop in the town that I live, and I love a charity shop find. So I've pretty much by and large stuck to that. If I buy new, I tend to buy something that might cost a bit more, but I know I'm careful about what I choose, and I know that I'll wear it a lot and it will stay in my wardrobe for a long time. So I made that commitment to not buy into the pace of the fast fashion world. But it's interesting to explore how cloth has been valued in the past. And I wanted to start with the 18th century. When you look at inventories of probate inventories, or the inventories of possessions that people left behind when they died, the second most valuable commodity that they owned after furniture was textiles, whether that was dress or household linen, but textiles were enormously valued. So if you think about dresses like this is an 18th century formal gown. I know not everybody has silk gowns, but I'm using this as an example of how the expanse of cloth would be valued. And it would, when you purchased a dress like this, or when you purchased the cloth for a dress like this, it was in the knowledge that at some point it will probably be remade. So often working in museums, in the past when I've worked with collections that had 18th century garments in them, there might be marks of different changes to seams and stitch marks where the dresses have been altered so that they would be brought more up to date, but the cloth itself was still valuable. And that remained the case for a very long time. By the 19th century, as fashions changed, that kind of cloth was still valuable. And so you do see some very lovely examples of, for example, particularly in the 1840s, for example, the reuse of late 18th century silk. This is an 18th century silk that has been made into an 1840s dress. So the style is very much of its fashionable silhouette of its moment, but the cloth that it is using hails from earlier decades. I spent a long time with some fabulous women scholars who helped me learn how to identify 18th and 19th century silks. So this is a sort of tribute to Dr. Leslie Miller, who was my tutor on the MA at Winchester course, the MA History of Textiles and Dress. A fantastic teacher who taught us all about how to identify 18th century silks. Also Barbara Berman, whose brilliant scholarship and thinking about the way dress is used has been enormously useful to me over the years, and Shelley Tobin, who's a curator at National Trust in Killerton House in Exeter, where I had my first voluntary job, and she's also the curator at the Royal Albert Memorial Museum in Exeter. So these women helped to shape my view of how to identify these things. The idea of recycling cloth really carried on through the 19th century, even when materials were, the production of things like cottons and printed cottons, calicos, silk weaving, cotton production was booming. There was still examples to be found of cloth being recycled from an earlier period. So for example, this from the John Bright collection in London. It's actually a fancy dress bodice that has been made out of an earlier man's waistcoat, a hand embroidered piece which is very much of its type, and then the sleeves have been added as a sort of later garment. And this happened for fancy dress. It was a way of families reusing the garments that they had in the attics, perhaps. There was a real rage for fancy dress parties in the 19th century. I think that would be a nice video to do another day, to look at the absolute craze for elaborate fancy dress throughout the 19th century. But there was a particularly grand ball in 1897. The Duchess of Devonshire's ball had been held to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, and people that wanted to represent accurate versions of their ancestors did so by finding those 18th century polonaises and brocades and modernising them, but wearing them for this particular fancy dress ball. And you can see, for example, here, this is a version of one of those remodelled costumes that was used at that particular event. There have been many examples of designers who have embraced this idea of valuing cloth and thinking about fashion in a different way. And I'm not going to dwell too much on Fortuny today, because I think, again, he would be a really good subject for an episode another day. But Mariano Fortuny, who was a real polymath, he explored all sorts of different creative practices. But he is perhaps best known for his Delphos dresses and his pleated silks that he created in the early 20th century through to the end of the 1930s, early 1940s. And his idea was to produce something in the line of a capsule wardrobe, where you have lots of different variations of the same object, namely his pleated silk dress, that you could then accessorise with a range of different wraps or cloaks, evening coats, velvet. And the idea was that they could be interchanged with each other, so that you had a very simple basic wardrobe, but that you could alter by the variation of the things that you wore with them and the different shades. And it was a way of kind of standing out of fashion, really. It was an anti-fashion statement that became fashionable. So there was a tension there between his ambitions and actually what happened with the garments. But he is a real, the kind of Delphos dress that we see here with the shaded wraps were a testament to his commitment to creating a different way of thinking about fashion. We leap forward then really to the mid-20th century, and I know there are many things that go on in between, so this is really just a snapshot. But I wanted to think about the whole era of wartime fashion and what that meant when you're restricted in terms of the availability of materials. I think many people in the UK would be familiar with the initiative that was Make Do and Mend, the government initiative that was published in a pamphlet about how to look after clothes in order to extend their life more fully. And there were all sorts of bits of advice in this booklet about how to avoid moths, how to sew on patches, how to adapt garments. But there are a whole range of other things that went on around that. It wasn't just make, do and mend. There was, for example, Mrs. So-and-so. This was another government scheme. Mrs. So-and-so was a character created by the government to encourage people to improve their sewing skills and their imagination when it came to their wardrobes. Images like this that gave advice on how to remodel a hat, or how to apply a patch, how to make a pair of slippers, all sorts of different quick initiatives that were directed at women who were struggling to manage rationing with their limited access to clothing via the coupon system. There was, of course, the utility range, which was something I think I'll explore again in depth another time. But utility being a range of clothes that London fashion designers were tasked with designing that met a variety of austerity commitments. So a certain amount of cloth, a certain depth of hem, a certain number of buttons, those kinds of restrictions. And I always think it would make a brilliant student project to give students these kind of restricted materials and see where their creativity takes them. There were all sorts of advertisements in things like Vogue magazine for how to manage your wardrobe, and there were some brilliant images like this for enhancing what you already had, about how to take an old man's shirt and restyle it into a blouse, how to turn a man's suit into something that a woman could wear within the kind of cultural expectations of that particular time. There were other initiatives as well, like clothes swaps, that were brilliantly targeted towards young families who needed to be able to acquire new things as their children grew, so they would take them to be swapped out and go and find bigger examples. The post-war landscape of design is a really fertile one for adaptability, and so the American sportswear designers like Claire McCardell, Bonnie Cashin, Vera Maxwell, here are just a few of their examples that were about functional, usable, adaptable garments that could be really made to last and to extend their own lifetime, so that they could be part of a wardrobe for much longer. But more on them another time. And so it might be interesting if you want to think about this. This is the initiative, the Secondhand September, that Oxfam launched. You might be interested to give it a go. 30 days of not buying anything new, and maybe longer. If we want to try and change the way we think about clothes in light of the climate crisis that faces all of us, in light of the human cost of the fast fashion industry, with disasters like the Rana Plaza tragedy in poor factory conditions, it's something for us all to think about. But I think it doesn't mean you have to stop really enjoying clothes. It's just about a different kind of approach. So thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed, and see you again another time.